Hello everyone, and welcome to the third conversation in our Sidney Insights series. This is an online event designed to showcase the diversity of thought leadership and research within the college community. Today, third year history undergraduate Bijal Manoj Daialal will be interviewing by fellow Dr Helen Castor about her career to date, her published works, and her experiences as a Booker Prize judge, as well as comparing notes about life as a Cambridge student. This webinar will last for about an hour, and questions that have already been submitted to us here in the development office will be answered throughout the interview, and then there'll be a Q&A session at the end where you can submit questions. We will be recording this webinar so that we can share more widely with those who were unable to join the session live. Please can we ask that you also respect the speakers in not taking personal recordings or screenshots. We hope you enjoyed this conversation and welcome any feedback as we continue to develop these sessions. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you Anna for the introduction. So I'm Bijal, I'm a third year history undergrad here at Sydney. I'm currently looking at a range of histories covering a very wide geographic breadth, also across a range of time periods. I'm studying the history of the Indian subcontinent from the 19th century. I'm looking at early modern material culture, and I'm also studying a women's history of war in the 18th century. I'm also the president of Sydney's History Society, Confraternitas Historica, which provides the college's history community an opportunity to come together every fortnight and normally enjoy a presentation given by a guest speaker. But sometimes we also engage in intellectual discussions with each other. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm here today with the wonderful Helen Castor, who is a medieval and Tudor historian, as well as a broadcaster for TV and radio. And she's also the author of many fantastic books, including She-Wolves, The Women Who Ruled England Before Elizabeth, and Joan of Arc, which were both made into TV series. And I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk about all of this and more. He studied history at Cambridge and was a fellow at Sydney for 8 years, and is now currently a vice of the college. So thank you so much for joining us, Helen. How are you today?
I'm all right, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Wonderful. Well, Helen is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and was very excitingly made a judge for the Booker Prize Award in 2022. This is a very prestigious award given to a single piece of fiction. And I wanted to ask you, Helen, how you were selected to be a judge for these awards.
It's a very good question, because I was absolutely flabbergasted when I got the email. The answer is that it's the job every year of the brilliant director of the Booker Prize Foundation, Gabby Wood, to select, kind of cast a panel of judges, 5 judges, whose job is going to be, as you say, this extraordinarily, in a way, vague task to pick the best extended work of fiction published in English in the UK and Ireland that year. So the author can come from anywhere in the world, but it has to have been written in English and published in the UK and Ireland. And so Gabby's job is to find a group of 5 people that of varying experiences and perspectives who she think will make an interesting group of readers. It's not that there are particular categories of judge that have to be filled or anything like that. So I just got very, very lucky.
Very lucky. So you, like you said, you had the judges from multiple different backgrounds. Did you find that your background as a historian shaped the way you kind of approach different works? And do you think that this was different to some of your fellow judges and how they were?
It was very interesting once we all got into the room, because the whole process is fascinating from beginning to end, and really frightening at the beginning, because you know you're going to have to read something like 170 books in 6 months. So that's more or less a book a day. And it's the sheer volume at the beginning that is the most overwhelming thing. But once we got into the room, we discovered very, very quickly that we liked each other and we trusted each other, and it just started to become really interesting. I wasn't the only historian in the room. The chair of the panel was Neil McGregor, who's an art historian and an absolute legend on all sorts of fronts, but has run the National Gallery, has run the British Museum and so on. So I wasn't the only one coming with a historical perspective, but we were all really in there just as readers. It's not a prize that judges books on according to any technical set of criteria. It was about the books we loved. And one of the interesting things that happened as we narrowed down to our long list and then our short list was to discover that actually of the 6 books we ended up shortlisting, 4 of them dealt in a really profound way with history. History from various perspectives, particularly actually a recent perspective on history. 3 of the 6 books were set more or less, or in part at least, about 30 years ago, and a 4th then looking back at the last century from various perspectives. So it wasn't me pushing that, and it wasn't Neil pushing that. These were very much collective discussions, but I think this is a moment in time when writers of fiction are interested in historical perspectives, as they always are in a sense, but it seemed that some very particular concerns about change in the world and about intolerable circumstances in the world and how one lives through that were coming up in the books we were reading, and that we were responding very powerfully to that.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really interesting point about the groups of, like, which groups of people are interested in history and why the relevance of history is not kind of just restricted to kind of an academic discipline or something really niche, but have this kind of relevance to a lot of other people. I know that my kind of interest in history kind of stemmed from that kind of point of view, when like I learned about things like empire for the first time, and it really struck a little like, oh, like what was going on there? And now here I am. So the prize was awarded to gosh, okay, might butcher the pronunciation of his name. I'll give it a go. Shannon Karunatilaka. Apologies to him. The 7 Moons of Mali Almeida. So what stuck out to you with this piece of literature?
It is an astonishing book, and it's a brilliant read. I should say, first of all, that we absolutely loved our shortlist. We were so committed to all 6 books, and it was agonizing having to choose a winner, in fact. And I have a sneaking suspicion, I can't speak for the rest of the judges, of course. I have a sneaking suspicion that if we'd each chosen a winner as an individual judge, we might have ended up with 5 different books. But that's not to say that we didn't all absolutely, it was a completely unanimous decision in the end, after a day's discussion, to pick Shehan Karunatilaka's book. I think that's still not perfect, but we were trying our best to get it right. It's a book set in Colombo in Sri Lanka in 1990. The protagonist, Mali Almeida, is a war photographer who wakes up dead, and he has 7 days in the chaos of the intermediate stage of the afterlife to try and work out who killed him. So it's part whodunit, part thriller in that sense, but partly also a reflection on what it is to live and what it is to bear witness, and what it is to try to live in intolerable circumstances, and how to set about coping if change doesn't prove to be possible. But it's also very, very funny, and it's full of love and beautifully written, with an extraordinarily light touch, because it's a first person narrative written in the second person, which I only sort of noticed after the first few pages. You feel, you see, but it's Mali talking to himself. I can't recommend it highly enough. And also a chance to learn about Sri Lanka's history, about which I knew shamefully little.
No, I've honestly, it's been on my reading list, and like this is my push to actually go and buy it and give it a read. It does seem like a wonderful, wonderful book. And
so, when you have, I can't recommend the rest of the shortlist highly enough either, and the long list. And one of the things also, I mean, just as a sidebar, about the fact that the prize is so broad. An extended work of fiction, what is that? We're not even having to argue about what a novel is. Several of the books on the shortlist, 2 in particular, were 2 of the shortest books that have ever been on a Booker shortlist. So it's not that you're having to commit yourself to an enormous amount of time to plough through a weighty tome. There are some tiny gems on that list.
Like a recommendation for all of us here: get something from like TV and screens back into a good book. So you were a DOS, a director of studies at Sydney for 8 years, and before you went ahead and worked in the more public realm and in media. What drove this change?
Well, several things drove the change, really. One of them was a set of very pragmatic considerations. I think a lot of people know that academic careers are not easy to pursue. It's difficult to get academic jobs, and it's certainly difficult to coordinate academic jobs if you and your partner both happen to be academics. And that was the case for me in 2002. And I was going to have a baby. And I taught in Cambridge and my partner taught in Liverpool, and we had a flat in London. And when you add a baby into that mix, something's going to have to give. So, but of course, something giving is a very different question from what actually ended up transpiring. But that circumstance pushed me into thinking about what it was that I wanted to do. And I had absolutely loved being at Sydney, loved being a director of studies, was doing all sorts of other things, also being a tutor, being on council and so on. And I had managed to finish the monograph that came out of my PhD. So in a sense, I'd completed that big piece of academic work. And the question was what I was going to write next. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wanted to write something a bit different. And I should also say that 20 years on, it's much more common, I think, now for academic historians from within universities to write books that are public facing, to write books for commercial presses that are very serious works of history, but that are speaking in a language that is designed to be more accessible. It's not that no one was doing it 20 years ago, not at all, but it was less common for people to be doing that from inside academia. And also I knew that I'm a slow writer and new baby and so on. I just decided that I would like to try writing something for a wider readership, to use the research that I'd already done and the research that I wanted to do, and not to compromise all the methods and the standards that I'd learned in academia, which were and are fundamentally important to me. But I wanted to learn to write in a new way and to tell a story. I wanted to start writing narrative history. And it's not that narrative history is incompatible, again, with what academic history sets out to do, but I wanted, in a sense, to have that freedom to tell a story in a slightly different way. And I was lucky enough, I spent 6 months writing a proposal, found myself an agent with his help, spent 6 months writing a proposal, and I was lucky enough to get a book deal just at the right time. And I was also very lucky that Sydney allowed me to keep a relationship going. So I feel very, very fortunate all around.
Nice. Well, that's kind of what stuck out to me the most when I read She Wolves, is that it does have this very beautiful kind of like novel-like structure. And you kind of, and even in your preface, you kind of begin by saying it's going to be a work of storytelling rather than theory and cross-cultural comparison. And to be honest, very personally, just as like being a history undergrad, gosh, it was one of the most refreshing things to read. I was like, oh, this is nice. This is like kind of going back to the histories I read as a kid. So it was really wonderful to read. You kind of touched on it a little bit, but do you feel that then writing kind of as a public historian, as it were, has quite different aims to when you were writing as an academic?
In a way, the aims aren't necessarily different, in that I think we're all trying to explore the lost reality of the past. And there are, of course, as many ways of doing that as there are historians, all of them valuable. But what I have become well, what I think I was grasping towards when I started writing that first proposal, and what I have pursued more and more certainly ever since, is that what I'm trying to do is to, through this kind of storytelling, I'm trying to stand in the shoes of the people that I'm writing about, and I'm trying to look through their eyes. Now, I know lots of historians would say, well, we are too, but the difference I'm finding from the work I did before is that when I was writing my PhD, for example, there's a kind of academic analysis, hugely valuable, that stands with a sort of eagle eye, looking analytically across the whole range of the available sources, which of course in the Middle Ages are always partial, they're always complicated. Any sources are, but particularly in the Middle Ages, it's like trying to do a jigsaw with half the pieces missing, which I've always loved. But with that kind of analytical eye, in a sense, you're looking for patterns and you're looking for explanatory frameworks. And I loved doing that for my PhD and learned such a lot. But what I'm trying to do now, because I'm writing narrative, because I'm writing chronological narrative, I am being forced to stand in the shoes of the people that I'm writing about, remembering that they don't know what's about to happen. So I, in my writing, must also not know what's about to happen, or else I can't properly get a sense of what their thought processes might be. If I'm already looking for the explanation of what happens 2 weeks hence, I'm prejudging the evidence that I'm looking for on this Tuesday. So that has become absolutely the guiding light to me in how to approach my sources, but also what I genuinely believe is the value of adding this kind of narrative history into the academic conversation, because certainly it's been true of all my books very powerfully. And the one I'm writing at the moment, I'm in edits on a book that I'm writing at the moment, and every time my editor has said, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, it's usually because I'm looping back to explain something that's already happened. And if I put that back in its right place in the chronology, more things start to become clear, and I'm able to join more dots. So I really believe in the analytical value of writing narrative history. And it's also psychologically fascinating to try. My last book was about Joan of Arc. I mean, it sounds enormously presumptuous to talk about trying to put yourself into the shoes of Joan of Arc. But what I mean by that is she didn't know she was going to die. She didn't know she was going to be captured. She believed that God was going to save her right up till almost the very end of her life. And so writing her story from that point of view opened up huge vistas for me as a historian.
Yes, yeah, I think you highlight something so important, which I think in academia is a bit easier to lose track of, the hindsight thing, the benefits of hindsight, and how that kind of does change your arguments, change your writing. So that's, yeah, I think that's something, that divide between academia and public historian, I think there's something there to be like learned from both sides. I don't know, do you even think that that distinction of academia public like is what is worth making, is kind of a valuable one to make?
I think it is. It's a complicated one. I recognize the term public historian without necessarily being able to give you a quick and easy definition of what it is, because it can encompass so many things. I mean, obviously the whole world of museums, the whole world of maintaining spaces that are open to the public, that have historic value, the idea of communicating publicly. But there's not an impenetrable wall that divides what happens within universities from any of that. After all, it's all linked in. So, and I would very much want to see universities as they are public institutions, permeable in both directions. So I like to think of it as a big conversation that should be joinable from all sorts of perspectives, and is at its best and most productive when it's joined from all sorts of perspectives.
I would, a difficult question, and I think I'd have to agree. Your book, well, She-Wolves and Joan of Arc, they were both made into TV series. Did you find that how did you find the experience of communicating that historical work through the medium of television?
I absolutely loved it, I have to say. It was such a joy and a privilege on all sorts of levels. Stop me if I'm going on too long because I might get a bit carried away. But the first thing to say is I was working with some extraordinary people. I was really fortunate that the director that I worked with, I mean, I've worked with a number of directors who've all been brilliant, but the Lucy Swingler, the director who I worked with on both of those particular projects, is a historian herself by training, and also a very brilliant director. So she was fantastic at translating my historical academic perspectives into something a bit more user-friendly when it needed to be. But also that process of working in a team with a brilliant cameraman. We worked in the same small little team for both things, brilliant soundman, brilliant assistant producer. And writing is so solitary that the excitement of working in a little crew like that in a very intense way, particularly because obviously there's never enough budget, there's never enough time. So you're working very intense days, often on location, and you get to know each other really well, really quickly. And it's a huge laugh, very tiring. But it's also a real education in how to tell a story in a different way. You very quickly learn, as someone concerned with words normally, that the words are important, but television is a visual medium, and having to learn to speak in to work with a different grammar is really thought-provoking. And particularly when you're dealing with the Middle Ages, because you don't have archive footage, you don't have interviewees who were there, you have to find ways of working inventively with locations, with documents, and then, my God, the excitement of getting to go to some of these places. And even though, of course, I'm lucky to have access as a researcher to archives, but some of these documents are so precious that if you turn up saying I'm a researcher, they'll just say, well, it's been edited and published. You know, why do you need to see the original thing? But bring a TV camera with you and you're going to get to see the trial transcript of Joan of Arc or whatever it is. So the thrills, the exhaustion, the terror, I'm not used to, you know, I wasn't at all used, still not used to being in front of a camera, but an enormous learning curve and an enormous thrill. And then I just have to hide behind the sofa when it actually goes out because I don't like watching myself.
Well, you kind of mentioned that, yeah, it is a different medium. It's a visual medium. Do you think that it was because it's kind of such a different format, because as a medieval historian you don't have access to kind of interviewers' footage, it was maybe difficult to convey certain historical issues and tensions or nuances? And then maybe if you have an example of kind of how you and your crew and your team decided, like how you overcame those issues.
It is always a challenge. And when people sometimes get frustrated about particular kinds of stories not getting shown on television, I think I hadn't realized as a viewer quite how much you do have to think about the visual side of things, that when you're saying, well, this would be a great story, the first question is always, what are you showing on screen? And often as a medievalist, I'm ending up saying, well, there'll be me telling you about it, or we can look at a castle or whatever. So you have to have a brilliant director and a brilliant team who can think of ways around that. Documents and objects are fantastic if you can interact with them. Sometimes, I mean, I'm not a great dresser-upper. Lucy Worsley is brilliant at dressing up. I have dressed up a couple of times, but I like it to be for a very clear reason. Otherwise, I just look, you know, Lucy has this wonderful, she's a great sort of presence and performer, and I just look a bit embarrassed if I'm wearing a costume for no reason. But I did get to wear some 16th century armour at one, or replicas at one point, and that was fascinating for the experience of feeling what it was like to put on and so on. But I do think there is room still for storytelling in a relatively simple way. And one of the things I feel very, very grateful about is, again, to have hit a moment with She-Wolves where BBC4 was still willing to commission a history series that was essentially storytelling. She-Wolves, the television series, was just me telling the story. We didn't have talking heads. We didn't have dressing up. We had some key documents, some key objects, and we had some amazing locations, and we had a brilliant team. And I was allowed to just tell those stories, and people seem to have responded to it. Sadly, BBC4 doesn't have a budget to make any more original programmes. So these things are getting more and more difficult, but I feel very proud that we did that, because I think there is still a place for that, as well as more elaborate setups with an all singing, all dancing cast, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really interesting point there. Have you found that when you are kind of writing for a wider public, that there's limits or constraints on the types of histories that you're able to tell? So of course you were talking in more of a TV context, but do you think it applies more generally to maybe to your writing, to radio, to the other kind of works you do?
Yes, because you do need to persuade a commissioner of some sort, whether it's TV, radio, or a publisher, to invest in you. It's easier with books because words can take you anywhere. With television, to a lesser extent radio, there's always the question of, as I say, what are we going to see? How is this going to work in this medium? Words can take you anywhere in the past, but a publisher is a commercial operation. So you have to have a why. Why do you want to tell this story? To a certain extent, it's always important to remember, I don't know if you've read, there are some brilliant books about Hollywood by William Goldman. The first one called, I think, Adventures in the Screen Trade. And his mantra, the Hollywood mantra, is no one knows anything. In other words, the studios don't know what films are going to be successful. The filmmakers don't know what films are going to be successful. And in a way, it's a very consoling thing to bear in mind, that you have an idea for a book that you desperately want to write. And if you get some no's, it's not because it's a terrible idea. It's because no one knows what's going to be a success, what people are actually going to want to read. You just have to keep trying and keep rethinking it, reshaping it. But broadly speaking, I would say there's going to be a reason why you want to tell this story. And if you can convey that with enough conviction and enough passion, there's a good chance you can persuade someone. In a way, She-Wolves is a really good idea, because when I had that idea, when I first had it, I wasn't actually completely convinced it was going to work, because I thought, well, I'm a historian of politics, I'm a historian of power. And I suddenly thought, I want to write about women. I wasn't a historian of women thinking I'm going to write about power and women. I was a historian of power thinking I'd like to write about women. And I had to construct this framework. I picked these 4 women out of the political history of the Middle Ages and was trying to sort of join dots between them and frame it within this moment in the middle of the 16th century, where England just was going to get a reigning queen for the first time, like it or not, which had suddenly struck me as a really extraordinary and revealing point. But I was really worried people were going to say, well, you picked these 4 women at random, what connects them, why have you got... And then as I set about writing the book, it turned out that it did become something bigger than the sum of its parts. So yeah, I think sometimes you start with an idea, sometimes you start with a moment, sometimes you start with a person, sometimes you start with an event. But if it becomes a story you want to tell, then there's a good chance that you're going to be able to persuade people that it's worth listening to.
Oh, gosh, the thing you said at the end about it kind of coming together at the end and all making sense, God, that resonates so much. I think that's how most of my history writing goes. When I finish it, I'm like, right, now I'm seeing what I was talking about when it's all there, it's all in front of you. I don't know if it comes to life on its own, really, or something like
that. Well, and that's one of the difficulties, after all, of writing a weekly essay, because you only had a week to try and absorb all this reading. It would be amazing if you'd got to the nub of things in just a week. But yes, if it's any consolation, it is still happening to me. It's happening to me in the edits on the book I'm writing at the moment. I've got to the end of a whole first draft and I'm going back to the beginning and saying, oh, now I can see what's going on here. And there's something wrong if that's not happening, I think.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about the work you're doing right now? It's a title, The Eagle and the Heart, if I'm correct, and is due to appear this year. It's very exciting.
Actually, we've just this minute, yesterday, decided it will probably be spring 2024. We just need a little bit longer to do the, oh my God, what's happening in this book? It's coming together really well, but yes, spring 24. It's the story of Richard II and Henry IV. So men, I'm doing men in the foreground for the first time in a while. Well, that's not true. They're always in the foreground, aren't they? That's the way of things. But the striking thing for me is that there are very few women with any agency in this story. And that too is an interesting distinction. But this is a story of two first cousins, almost exactly the same age. One becomes king when he's 10 years old, when they're both 10 years old. And the other then deposes him when they're 33 and takes the throne for himself. These are reigns that are well known through Shakespeare. Richard II is one of Shakespeare's most glorious plays, and the two parts of Henry IV, some of his most complicated in a way. But I wanted to tell the story of both these men, and through them to look at what happens to a political system and a whole constitution, a political system of sophistication that has grown up over hundreds of years, when the person in charge of it turns out to be a pathological narcissist. And it's a story I've been wanting to tell for a long time, but it does feel as though it's a story that, if we look around the world in the last few years, it's a story that has very striking resonances for me. The idea that the Middle Ages, that the 14th century is too long ago to be relevant, is one I've never subscribed to, but in a way, it's never felt more relevant to me than what I'm working on now.
Thank you. Oh gosh, that sounds very, very exciting. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about your time at Sydney and Cambridge. So you were here for 8 years as a director of studies. That is a long time. Is there something that you really miss about being at Sydney?
I think Sydney is a wonderful and extraordinary place. It is a community, it really is. And it's a community of such warmth, or in my experience, such warmth, that you rarely find anywhere else, I think. And that was clear to me from the very beginning of arriving at Sydney. I arrived as a relatively young new college teaching officer and director of studies. I'd been a research fellow for 1 year at another college, but that was all. So I felt thrown in the deep end. And I was the only teaching fellow in history, but there were 3 professors in Sydney at that point, professors in history, Derek Beals, Tim Blanning and Tony Badger. And they welcomed and supported me in such an extraordinary way. And I think that's very related to the fact that they had all been Sydney students themselves. They were Sydney through and through. It was palpable how much they had received from the college, but how much they were giving back, how committed they were to teaching. It wasn't at all that they were remote professors leaving me to get on with it. And I think that set the tone for me within Sydney, and it proved to be true of the wider community as well. And I loved having that experience and that responsibility of seeing students all the way through, from admissions all the way through to graduation. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing.
Really nice. I can very much attest to the warmth of Sydney's community, especially the history community. We did it quite well, and nothing attests to it more, I think, than Conflict, the History Society. I hope to hear that it was running as strong when you were there.
Absolutely,
as it has been.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, because there's such a strong sense of the history of Confrat that it feels like if you drop the ball, it would be too terrible for the ball to be dropped in your tenure. I mean, I hope you're feeling it as a joy rather than a pressure as this year's president, but it's that sense of a baton being passed on, and that being a very special thing for Sydney's historians, I think.
No, I can say it's going strong. We've got Professor Mary Fulbrook coming next week, so it's very exciting. Do you have a favourite Confrat memory?
To be honest, I just have this sort of, when you say Confrat, I feel this warm glow, because it was lovely. Both the meetings, I mean, of course, so many different kinds of meetings and interesting things being talked about, but the fact that Sydney's undergraduates and graduates, of course, but that Sydney's undergraduates actually come and feel part of it, and then to have the dinner, which really is a celebration, and to see generations. I mean, I know I was only there as Director of Studies 8 years, but in that time, that was enough to see a couple of generations go all the way through. And yeah, it was just a very, very special thing to be part of.
I'm so glad to hear it. I know that you were undergraduate history at Cambridge yourself, and I wanted to ask if you felt that studying at Cambridge if it had transformed quite significantly from when you were an undergrad to when you were teaching here, especially in relation to if you felt that the way gender history was being taught, or the types of histories that were on offer, or something along those lines.
It's a really interesting question. In one sense, of course, there are enormous continuities, and I'm very delighted to say that those continuities are there, because the fact that at the core of the experience of being an undergraduate historian in Cambridge still is the writing of a weekly essay, out of which you get one-to-one tuition, one-to-one feedback, and that whole process is contained within an institution that has world-class libraries. It's an extraordinary privilege to be part of, whether as a student or a teacher, and I'm so delighted that focus on reading and writing and conversation about history is there and is not changing anytime soon. On the other hand, of course, the whole question of what is the syllabus, what are the histories that we're looking at, is and should be part of the conversation that is going on. And you're absolutely right to point out the nature of changes in the institution. I mean, when I arrived at Keys in 1986, women had been admitted to the college for, I think, 7 years out of its 638-year history. And that wasn't something that I think we were very sort of heavily aware of at the time. But looking back, that's a pretty major contextual part of our experience as young women undergraduates. Things have, of course, moved on very quickly since then. But one of the things that was very much in train when I was Director of Studies and working within the faculty was Tripos reform, which was decades in the making. And you, of course, are part of a cohort that has been there when Tripos reform finally is actually happening. So that's a huge change I want to ask you about. And also the other thing I'm extraordinarily aware of, I'm talking to my son, who is a student at Cambridge in a different college in a different subject, but he can never quite believe, understandably, that we didn't have mobile phones and we didn't have computers. And of course, that affects everything, social life, all kinds of interaction. But I'm also aware of how much it changes work and teaching. I was a dinosaur even then when I stopped full-time teaching, that I used to want my students to write their essays out longhand. And my thinking was, first of all, you have to plan if you're writing longhand. You can't just cut and paste and shift things around. And secondly, you'll be doing exams in a room for 3 hours writing longhand. You need to make sure that your handwriting is legible, and you need to make sure that you can still write that volume confidently and clearly. All of that's being swept away as well, of course, post-pandemic. So I really need to hand over to you to ask you what it's like, having come through the pandemic, Tripos reform finally coming in, and where not just the writing of history essays, but history examinations is now becoming a computerized online phenomenon.
No, I think it would be fair to say I've had quite a unique time as a historian here, because you mentioned those Tripos reforms. So not my year, but the freshers that had come this year, it's gone back to kind of the traditional 3-hour handwritten exams. And even the nature and structure of what they do, it's not exactly a weekly essay. They kind of seem to be balancing a few different things at once. It is very different to what I've done in my almost 3 years here now. So coming in, writing it, well, my first thing is, even I find it so difficult to fathom that you guys were here without kind of the tech and the gadgets and the phone. Like, you actually use the pigeonholes to communicate.
We did. I keep trying to say, if you wanted to get in touch with someone, you had to knock on their door and leave a note, or leave a note in the pigeonhole, or wander around college places, wander around the library trying to find them. And it was rather, I mean, there were bits about it that were rather nice in all sorts of ways, but totally different from life now.
It's totally different. I don't know if me and my friends could ever coordinate anything to happen if we were left to do anything like that. But yeah, in terms of actually like the structure of writing, I think it's crazy. I have not written a handwritten exam in my entire time here, because not only were my weekly essays online, but examinations in first year and second year, and also for my third year, are going to be open book, online, and you get a lot more time than what you'd traditionally have. So it's almost like it's a completely different skill set that's being examined, really. Maybe some people would be a little bit envious of that, with how much, you don't have to really rely on memorization or anything, but the quality of answers that a lot of my kind of peers and can produce under those conditions is very incredible. So I think it definitely has its pros and cons. It isn't just a straightforward, it does make life so much easier. I think it ups the ballpark a lot more. I do think there is something to be said that I think it does prepare you quite a little bit better for like work after Sydney, after you graduate, because this is kind of how most people operate and work outside of academia and school.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because I think the Tripos reform discussions that I was part of in the 90s were all focused on content, and that is a hugely important element, that review of what histories we're studying and so on, researching. But as far as I remember, there was at that stage the idea of reviewing forms of assessment. Some things were coming in gradually, themes and sources was coming in, a move towards more people doing dissertations, a move towards obviously the long essay in themes and sources. But I think the traditional 3-hour exam was, it felt at the time very much the cornerstone of how assessment was going to be done. And that sense of unexpected interventions, none of us saw the pandemic coming in quite the way it did, or unfolding in quite the way it did. And the idea that that has absolutely kick-started what is, as you're saying, a revolution in ways of examination that then make us question what it is we are actually trying to test, what skill sets we're trying to come out with. Sidebar, this is all fascinating for me because I've been writing my way through the 14th century, and the light that gets shed on the experience of living through the Black Death. I know totally different circumstances, but the psychology of it, what it is to be hit by what they literally thought was an act of God, and the unexpected results that feed out of it. And your open book exams are one of them, I think.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. They are. Yeah. You know, I think there's that tendency a little bit maybe to be like, oh, we've made things too easy for them. You know, they can just go.
I don't think there's anything easy about a 5-hour or a 24-hour open book exam.
I would, from experience, I would disagree.
Yeah, differently difficult, I would say.
And we've been having a very wonderful conversation, but I think what I'm going to do now is shift over to a Q&A for some questions that have been submitted by people that are watching. So, Helen, do you think that the amount of misogyny in the historical past is a very deeply depressing thing for you?
That's an interesting question. To be completely honest, I find misogyny of the present world an awful lot more depressing than the misogyny of the past, in the sense that the past is the past and we can't affect it. I find it fascinating to study. I find it enlightening to study. What I find deeply depressing is what is happening in the world today, and the sense that misogyny, a little bit like water, that if you block it off from flowing in one place, it will find another way. It will find another way through. So I would certainly want to make that connection, that the work that I've done on medieval and Tudor politics, it may seem rarefied and a long time ago, but I think that strand in what I'm looking at feels enormously current and enormously relevant to me.
Quite a long question, actually, but quite an interesting one. So, when Elizabeth II died, the wording of the national anthem changed, as did the titles given to barristers, now to be known as the King's Council, Queen's Council. So, as an expert in the history of queens, do you have any thoughts on why the long decades of Elizabeth II's reign in the country was never referred to as the United Queendom?
Very good and interesting question. And the answer will take us a long way back, I think. The word kingdom has a very, very long history. And in its original meaning, the suffix dom on kingdom originally means a sort of state of being. So kingdom means the state of being a king. And you can see that sort of meaning of it in other words. I mean, obviously earldoms and dukedoms and so on. But if you think, for instance, about martyrdom, the state of being a martyr, or boredom, the state of being bored, it's that kind of sense. So kingdom is the state of being a king, and it then only becomes a system of government with a king at the top of it, and then it becomes the territory that is ruled by that system of government. And the roots of all of that lie in a period where it is absolutely taken for granted that a king rules and a king is a man because only men rule. Men rule and women don't. So the word queen in its original meaning means the wife of a king, because they are two separate jobs. A woman is the consort, produces the heirs, and the man does the actual ruling. So the word kingdom in that sense isn't just the property that belongs to whoever happens to sit on the throne. It is rooted in the whole system of thought that says that men rule and women don't. And the word queen, meaning the wife of a king, ends up getting used in those rare circumstances where a hereditary monarchy, because heredity is not entirely controllable, ends up throwing up a female heir. And Western Europe is what I happen to know about. France made the decision, no, we're not going to have any of those. We're going to invent a rule that says that women can't rule. And what England did at the point in the middle of the 16th century where there were only women left on the Tudor family tree is say, okay, we will have a queen and she will be a queen regnant. But if you look in English and British history at, for instance, the business of what the husbands of queens are called, a king's wife is always the queen, but a queen's husband is not always a king. And in fact, every husband of a reigning queen that we've had, a different set of things have happened. He's been called a different thing for different reasons. Mary Tudor's husband was called king. Mary II's husband, William, was made king and carried on ruling after her death. But Victoria's husband, Elizabeth II's husband, Queen Anne's husband, they were not kings. So a queen, a reigning queen, is always an anomaly. And the whole structure around it is not just altered to fit with her. Anything that is personal to her, so Queen's Council, God Save the Queen, it's because she personally is sitting at the head of the legal system or at the head of our government at that time. But the kingdom is a bigger entity than the person at the head of it now. And the fundamental rooted assumptions are that it will be a man in charge. And after all, it's only just over 10 years ago that the law was changed to allow female heirs to have the same rights as male heirs, and the aristocracy are still not doing that. So yeah, long answer, sorry, but a very, I find that kind of linguistic question very interesting.
On greater reflection, it's crazy how much it reveals behind it, just a word, the history behind that word, actually, because it's never a question I thought of. These are things that you kind of almost take as neutral for granted, like kingdom. Don't think I've ever really reflected on the term kingdom.
I would, if I have a tip from the writing that I've done over the last 20 years, for me, the Oxford English Dictionary, the full one, the one that's online, the massive one, is a huge resource, because any word that you come across, you can look up there and see the whole etymology, see when the earliest examples that they've been able to find in recorded English are, and you get a real sense of what the central concepts that have fed into that word are. And I use the OED all the time, not least because, again, quick sidebar, when I'm writing my books now and I'm trying to be in the moment, I try very hard. I'm not using contemporary appropriate language, but I try not to use words that weren't around in that time. So for instance, I don't say somebody found themselves in the spotlight, because they didn't have spotlights then. I'm trying not to pull you out of the moment. But for instance, in She-Wolves, I made a deliberate decision not to use the word gender, because the way the word gender was used then was very, very different from the ways we've begun to use it in the 20th and then now the 21st century. So because I'm trying to inhabit that moment, I deliberately didn't use that word. I tried to be clear about what I meant in terms that they were actually using in England in the Middle Ages.
A very, I think, great point that your work as kind of a public historian writing narratives has made so kind of blaringly obvious, which, at least in my opinion, I think in academic history, tends to be a little bit overlooked. Or just, sidelined. It's important, but it's not stressed upon the way I think you've emphasized today. Another question that was submitted, which I think you've kind of touched upon a little bit. Do you think that pre-modern history has any relevance for public policy making today? And really, I think the work you're doing now has made that kind of quite obvious. But if you have anything else to share.
Yeah, I certainly, it's not that I'm claiming that it has a sort of instrumental use. I'm not saying that government committees should be opening their medieval history books before they do anything else. But I certainly feel that the history that I look at, and not just political history, also social history, medical history, economic history, there is so much that is resonant and that is revealing. And sometimes you see things, if you go back to the Middle Ages, where institutional frameworks were much less elaborated, if you like. I mean, it's easy to look at the modern world and think, well, everything is mechanized, everything is institutionalized. Actually, it's still human beings who run everything. And that facet is clearer, if you like. It's one of the things I've always loved about medieval history. I love the jigsaw piece with half the puzzles missing, and I love the fact that we're talking about so clearly about individual human beings. It's not that I love monarchy as a system of government, but I love what it shows about people in power. And so, yes, some examples I've already mentioned. I think the experience of pandemics is something that, despite everything that is different medically and to do with globalization and so on, it was extraordinary how many parallels and how many insights you could get by, I was literally writing a little bit about the Black Death when the pandemic hit. Then what it is, as I say, to have a narcissist with megalomaniac tendencies in the top seat of power, and some of the ways that can be dangerous. Conversely, how important it is in a leader to be aware of and think about the interests and the rights of everyone that they represent. And that is as true of a medieval monarch as it is today, because medieval monarchs, if they were going to do their job properly, did represent the interests of the people they ruled. So that kind of political and constitutional thinking that in a sense is very starkly revealed in the Middle Ages, because not so overlaid with centuries of further accretion. And then things like, the way maps of nation states, one might have thought, coming out of the 19th and 20th centuries, one might have thought that the map of nation states was settled, but the end of history is never the end. And again, in the 14th and 15th centuries that I'm looking at, one of the things I'm fascinated by is the attempt of the Dukes of Burgundy to create a new Burgundian state out of parts of Western France, parts of the Low Countries, which for 100 years was one of the richest, most sophisticated, most influential states in Western Europe. And then, because the heir turned out to be a woman who died young, it ended up being carved up and subsumed into the Habsburg Empire. But had that not happened, the map of Western Europe could look very, very different now. In fact, one of my favourite anecdotes, as it were, if Mary Queen of Scots had had a child in her first marriage, and if Mary Tudor had had a child of her marriage, England and the Netherlands would have ended up being ruled together, and France and Scotland would have ended up being ruled together. It's still possible the United Kingdom would have ended up as the United Kingdom, but we would have had to have taken a very different route to get there.
Well, I think that can really put to rest any accusations that medieval period has no relevance for us today. It's not worth doing. But I don't think that, and neither do you. So thank you so much for taking the time to answer my questions, Helen. It's been so interesting, so wonderful. We've touched on so many different topics. Managed to squeeze it in all in good time, I would say. This is very impressive. So once again, thank you,
Bijal, for being a superb interviewer. Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, pleasure's all mine. So I'm going to hand it over to Anna to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you to both Bijal and Helen. That was really great. Thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. As I said at the beginning, if you have any feedback or if you have any ideas for future insights, please do let us know. But we will let you get on with your day, and thank you to everyone. Thank you. Bye.